Welcome. You have made it to this quiet moment. As you settle in, let your breathing slow. Let the concerns of the day fade one by one. Tonight we're going to explore how people survived winter by sleeping beneath the earth. Not in caves they happened upon, but in homes they carved deliberately into the ground. For centuries, across medieval Europe and the American frontier, families descended into the soil to find warmth. They dug pits into hillsides. They cut bricks from prairie grass. They built roofs from the same earth they walked upon. In these spaces they slept through nights that could stretch 16 hours. They waited out storms that lasted days. They found silence where the wind above screamed at 60 miles per hour. This is not a story of desperation alone. It is the story of a practical understanding that the earth itself maintains a constant temperature just a few feet down, regardless of what happens in the air above. Over the next while, we'll move through the logic of these shelters. We will see how they were built, how they worked, and what it meant to sleep within them. So settle in. Let the story unfold at its own pace. Winter in certain parts of the world is not merely cold. It is a season that renders the landscape lethal. On the Great Plains of North America, temperatures could drop to 40 degrees below zero. The wind moved without obstruction across hundreds of miles of flat grassland. There were no forests to break its force, no natural barriers to slow it down. In medieval northern Europe the cold was different but no less severe. Winters lasted half the year. Frost penetrated deep into the ground. Rivers froze solid. Daylight became scarce. For the people living in these places, survival depended on solving a specific problem: how to stay warm through the night when staying warm was not guaranteed. A human body generates heat, but it also loses heat. In freezing air, the loss happens faster than the body can compensate. Without adequate shelter, a person will not survive until morning. The challenge was compounded by the scarcity of materials. On the American frontier there were no trees. Timber had to be hauled across great distances, if it could be obtained at all. Stone was similarly rare in many areas. In early medieval Europe resources varied by region, but for many rural communities access to quality building materials was limited. Peasants could not afford the wood or stone used in manorial construction. This scarcity forced people to look at what was available, and what was available almost everywhere was the ground itself. The earth had properties that other materials did not. It was dense, it blocked wind, it absorbed sound, and most importantly it held a stable temperature. At a depth of just 5 or 6 feet, the soil in most climates maintains a temperature close to the annual average of that region. In areas where the yearly average is around 50 degrees, the ground at that depth stays near 50 degrees all year. In summer, this makes the subsurface cooler than the air. In winter, it makes the subsurface warmer. This thermal stability is the result of something called thermal mass. Soil has high heat capacity, meaning it absorbs and stores heat slowly. It also has low thermal conductivity, meaning it transfers heat slowly. When the air temperature drops rapidly, the soil does not follow. There is a delay, a lag. By the time the cold begins to penetrate deeper into the ground, the season has often already started to turn. For someone living on the surface in a wooden structure, the walls offer little protection. Wood transmits temperature changes quickly. Wind penetrates gaps between boards. The interior temperature closely follows the exterior temperature, but for someone living below the surface, the walls themselves are a source of relative warmth. The soil is not trying to steal heat from the body. It is radiating a steady 50 degrees. This difference is the foundation of subterranean survival. It is not a trick. It is physics. People in different parts of the world, separated by centuries and thousands of miles, arrived at the same conclusion. When the air becomes unlivable, descend. The structures they built were not identical. They varied in depth, in design, in the materials used for roofing. But the principle was the same. In medieval England and continental Europe, these structures were called Grubenhäuser. The term translates roughly to sunken featured building. Archaeologists have found hundreds of them, dating from the 5th century through the 12th. On the American frontier in the 19th century, settlers built dugouts and sod houses. They carved homes directly into creek banks and hillsides. They used the prairie itself as building material. Both traditions emerged from necessity. Both relied on the Earth's ability to insulate and protect. The people who lived in these homes understood something modern populations often forget. Warmth is not about heating the air. It is about preventing heat loss. A fire can raise the temperature of a room, but if the walls are thin and the wind is strong, the heat escapes as quickly as it is generated. The fire must burn constantly. Fuel is consumed at an unsustainable rate. But if the walls are thick and dense, if they block the wind entirely, then a small fire can maintain livable conditions. The heat generated by human bodies alone, combined with the stable temperature of the earth, can be enough. This is why the dugout worked. This is why families survived. The choice to build underground was not romantic. It was not about connecting with nature or living simply. It was a calculated response to an environment that offered no other viable option, and it worked. For centuries it worked. To understand why people chose to dig down rather than build up, you have to consider the forces they were resisting. Wind was the primary enemy. On the open plains, wind moved without interruption. It reached speeds that could knock a person off their feet. It carried snow horizontally, blinding and disorienting anyone caught outside. This wind did not simply make the air feel colder, it actively stripped heat from any surface it contacted. A wooden wall exposed to 60-mile-per-hour wind loses heat far faster than the same wall in still air. The phenomenon is called convective cooling. Moving air removes the thin layer of warmer air that forms next to a surface, replacing it with cold air. The process repeats continuously as long as the wind blows. For a structure built above ground, there is no escaping this. The wind contacts every surface. The walls, the roof, even the floor if it is elevated. Heat is pulled away in all directions, but below ground the wind cannot reach. The earth absorbs the force of it. The surface may be scoured and shaped by the wind, but a few feet down, the air is still. This stillness is one of the defining characteristics of the subterranean space. It is not merely the absence of wind, it is the creation of a stable environment where heat, once generated, has nowhere to go. The second advantage of descent is thermal buffering. The deeper you go, the less the temperature fluctuates. At the surface, the temperature might swing 50 degrees between day and night during certain times of year. 6 feet down, that swing reduces to almost nothing. This buffering is the result of the soil's thermal properties. Heat moves through soil slowly. It takes time for warmth from the sun to penetrate downward. It takes time for cold from the winter air to do the same. By the time the seasonal cold begins to affect the deeper soil layers, spring is often approaching. The subterranean dweller lives in a kind of delayed climate, insulated from the extremes of the present moment. The third factor is structural efficiency. Digging a pit requires less material than building walls from the ground up. On the American frontier, a settler arriving on the plains faced an immediate problem. Shelter was needed quickly, but there was no wood. Sod could be cut and stacked, but building a freestanding structure required thousands of bricks. A dugout carved into a hillside eliminated 3 of the 4 walls. Only the front facade needed to be constructed. The rest of the structure was simply the earth itself, already in place. This saved time, labour, and materials. A family could have a functional shelter in a matter of days rather than weeks. The same logic applied in medieval Europe. Digging a pit and erecting 2 posts to support a roof was faster and cheaper than constructing a full timber frame building. For people with limited resources, this efficiency was not optional. It was necessary. But efficiency alone does not explain the persistence of these structures. If they had been merely expedient, people would have abandoned them as soon as better options became available. In many cases, they did not. Families lived in dugouts for years, even decades. Some upgraded to frame houses and later returned to the dugout, finding it more comfortable in winter. This suggests that the subterranean home offered something the surface dwelling could not, and that something was consistent, reliable warmth. The logic of descent is the logic of working with the environment rather than against it. The earth provides mass, insulation, and stability. By descending into it, you harness those properties. You do not need to heat the soil. It is already warmer than the air. You do not need to block the wind. The earth has already done that. Your task is simply to maintain a small amount of additional heat, enough to raise the interior temperature from 50 degrees to something livable. This can be achieved with a modest fire. It can be achieved in some cases with body heat alone. The dugout is not a fortress. It does not dominate the landscape. It does not announce itself. It is a retreat, a withdrawal, a deliberate choice to let the earth do the work of protection. And in the cold months, when the surface world became hostile, that protection was the difference between survival and death. The construction of a dugout began with observation. A family did not simply choose a random spot and start digging. They read the landscape. The ideal site was a south-facing hillside or the bank of a creek. South-facing slopes received more sunlight, which helped dry the structure and provided a small amount of passive heating. Creek banks offered natural vertical surfaces, reducing the amount of excavation required. The soil itself mattered. Loam was preferable. It held its shape when cut, but was not so dense that digging became impossible. Clay was stronger, but harder to work. Sand was easy to dig, but prone to collapse. The presence of a root mat was crucial. In areas with thick prairie grass, the roots formed a dense, fibrous network that extended a foot or more into the soil. This network bound the soil together, preventing erosion and providing structural integrity to the walls. Once a site was selected, the actual digging began. This was done with shovels, pickaxes, and sometimes just sharpened sticks. The work was slow and physically exhausting. The excavation typically started at the base of the slope. The digger worked backward into the hill, creating a horizontal cut. The goal was to carve out a rectangular space large enough for the family to live in. Dimensions varied, but a typical dugout might be 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep, and 7 feet high at the centre. This provided roughly 200 square feet of interior space. The floor was left as bare earth, packed down by foot traffic. In some cases, a layer of flat stones was laid to keep the floor dry, but this required access to stone, which was not always available. The ceiling was the natural roof of the excavation, the underside of the hill. This had to be thick enough to provide insulation, but not so thick that it was prone to collapse. A thickness of 2 to 3 feet was common. The back and side walls were simply the cut faces of the soil. These walls needed to be as vertical as possible to maximize interior space and prevent dirt from constantly sliding into the living area. The front of the dugout was open to the air. This opening had to be closed with a constructed wall. This facade was the only part of the structure that required traditional building. Settlers used whatever materials they could find. Some built a frame of wooden posts and filled the gaps with stacked sod. Others used logs if they had access to timber. A few used stone. The door was set into this front wall. It was usually small and low, requiring a person to stoop to enter. This minimised heat loss. Cold air is denser than warm air and sinks. A low door kept the cold outside. Windows were rare. Glass was expensive and difficult to transport. A window also represented a thermal weak point. Every square foot of glass lost heat far faster than a foot of sod. When windows were included, they were small. A single pane, perhaps 12 inches square, set high in the front wall. This admitted some light, but did little to brighten the interior. The roof of the dugout required careful planning. The excavated ceiling provided insulation from above, but the front portion, over the constructed facade, had to be covered separately. This was done by extending rafters from the top of the front wall back to the natural ceiling of the dugout. These rafters were then covered with layers of brush, hay, and finally a thick blanket of sod. The weight of this roof was substantial. The sod alone could weigh several £100 per square foot. The rafters had to be strong enough to support this load without sagging or breaking. Collapse was a real risk. If the wood was weak, or if the roof became saturated with water, the entire mass could come down. Families sometimes woke to find cracks forming in the ceiling, a warning that the structure was failing. Once the dugout was complete, the final step was to let it settle. The freshly cut sod would compress under its own weight. The walls would dry and harden. The interior would begin to take on the smell of earth and smoke. This settling period could take weeks. During this time, the structure was vulnerable. Heavy rain could cause erosion. Frost could crack the walls. Animals might burrow into the loose soil. But if the dugout survived this initial period, it became remarkably stable. The sod roof developed a layer of living grass on top, which helped bind the structure together. The walls hardened into a solid mass. The dugout was not beautiful. It did not stand tall or command attention. From a distance it was barely visible, a subtle indentation in the hillside. But it was functional. It was warm, and for the people who built it, that was enough. On the treeless plains, the material for building was the ground itself. Specifically, it was the prairie sod, the densely rooted surface layer of soil that had formed over thousands of years. This sod was not ordinary dirt. It was a composite material, a matrix of grass roots, organic matter, and mineral soil. The roots of buffalo grass and blue stem grew in a tangled, interwoven network that could be several feet deep. When this layer was cut, it held together like fabric. A single brick of sod could be lifted, carried, and stacked without crumbling. The roots continued to bind the soil even after it was removed from the ground. Settlers called themselves sodbusters because breaking this layer for the first time was difficult work. The prairie had never been ploughed. The sod had never been disturbed. It resisted the blade. The tool used for cutting sod was a grasshopper plough, a specialised implement with a sharp, angled blade. A team of oxen or horses pulled the plough, and the blade sliced through the root mat, cutting strips approximately 12 inches wide and 4 inches thick. These strips were then cut into sections typically 3 feet long. Each section became a brick. A single acre of prairie could yield thousands of these bricks. The cutting was done in the morning when the soil was moist from dew. Moisture helped the bricks hold their shape. If the sod dried out, it became brittle and more likely to break apart during handling. The freshly cut bricks were heavy. A single 3-foot section could weigh 50 pounds or more. Lifting and stacking them was exhausting labour. Construction of a freestanding sod house began with laying the first course of bricks directly on the ground. There was no foundation in the modern sense. The weight of the structure itself was the foundation. The bricks were laid grass side down. This orientation allowed the roots to continue growing, knitting the bricks together over time. As the roots intertwined, the wall became a single cohesive mass rather than a loose stack. Each course was offset from the one below, a pattern called header and stretcher. This staggered arrangement distributed weight evenly and prevented vertical seams from forming, which would weaken the wall. Walls were built to a thickness of 2 to 3 feet. This mass was necessary for insulation. A thinner wall would allow too much heat to escape. A thicker wall required more material and labour without providing proportional benefit. As the walls rose, the builder had to ensure they remained vertical. A wall that leaned inward or outward would eventually collapse under the weight of the roof. Plumb lines and simple levels were used to check alignment. Door and window frames were set in place as the walls went up. These frames were wooden, often just rough-cut lumber. The sod bricks were stacked around them, leaving a gap above the top of the frame. This gap was intentional. As the sod settled and compressed over the first year, the wall would shrink. If the bricks were laid directly against the top of the frame, the settling wall would crush the frame and shatter any glass in the window. By leaving a gap and filling it with loose material like rags or straw, the builder allowed the wall to compress without damaging the frame. Once the structure had fully settled, the gap could be packed with sod. The corners of the building required special attention. Sod bricks do not interlock like manufactured bricks. Each corner had to be carefully stacked and periodically checked to ensure it was not leaning. When the walls reached the desired height, usually 7 to 8 feet, the roof construction began. This was the most challenging part of the process. A ridgepole was laid across the top of the 2 longest walls. This pole bore the weight of the entire roof. It had to be strong, straight, and resistant to rot. Ideally, the ridgepole was a cedar log, because cedar resists moisture better than other woods. But cedar was rare on the plains. More often, builders used cottonwood or willow, accepting that the wood would eventually decay and need replacement. Rafters ran from the ridgepole down to the top of the walls. These were smaller logs or heavy branches, spaced every few feet along the length of the building. Across the rafters, a layer of brush and small branches was laid. This created a rough surface to support the next layer. On top of the brush, a layer of hay or prairie grass was spread. This filled the gaps and provided a base for the final layer. The final layer was sod. Bricks were laid grass side up, covering the entire roof. This living layer of grass continued to grow, sending roots down through the hay and brush, binding the roof together. The weight of this roof was immense. A completed sod roof on a modest house could weigh 3 tons or more. When it rained, the sod absorbed water like a sponge, and the weight doubled. This is why the walls had to be so thick and so perfectly vertical. Any weakness, any misalignment, and the structure would fail. But if built correctly, a sod house could stand for years. The walls would harden into something almost like concrete. The roof would become a unified mass, heavy but stable. The interior was dark. The thick walls created deep window recesses that admitted little light. Even at midday, the corners of the room remained in shadow, but the interior was also quiet. The mass of the sod absorbed sound. Voices did not echo. Footsteps were muffled. Outside, noise, wind, animals, even nearby voices, rarely penetrated, and the interior was warm. In winter, when the temperature outside dropped below zero, the temperature inside remained steady. The walls radiated the faint warmth of the earth, and a small fire was enough to make the space comfortable. The sod house was not a temporary shelter, it was a permanent home, built to last. It required skill, labour and patience. But it provided something no other structure on the plains could offer: reliable protection from the cold. In early medieval Europe, between the 5th and 12th centuries, a similar form of subterranean dwelling appeared across wide regions. These structures are known to archaeologists as Grubenhäuser, a German term meaning sunken featured buildings. Hundreds of these structures have been excavated at sites throughout England, Germany, Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. They share common features, but they also vary significantly depending on region, period, and the social status of the inhabitants. The basic design was consistent. A rectangular pit was dug into the ground, usually between 1 and 5 feet deep. The dimensions of the pit varied, but a typical structure might measure 12 feet by 8 feet. At either end of the long axis, 2 substantial wooden posts were set into the ground. These posts supported a ridge beam that ran the length of the building. From this beam, a gabled roof extended down to ground level or slightly below. The roof was thatched, usually with reeds or straw. In some cases, turf was laid over the thatch to provide additional insulation and weatherproofing. The walls, if they existed as separate structures, were made of wattle and daub, woven branches covered with a mixture of clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung. In many cases, there were no walls at all. The roof extended directly to the ground, and the gable ends were closed with wooden planks or more wattle and daub. This created a small enclosed space, dark and low-ceilinged. An adult could not stand upright except directly beneath the ridge beam. One of the long-standing debates among archaeologists concerns the function of the pit itself. Was it the actual floor of the building, or was there a wooden floor suspended above it? Evidence from some sites suggests suspended floors. Charred planks have been found in the fills of excavated pits, indicating that wooden boards once spanned the space. Loom weights and other domestic items found at a consistent height above the pit floor support this interpretation. If the floor was suspended, the pit below served as a crawl space. This space would have provided insulation, keeping the living area above it separated from the cold, damp ground. It might also have been used for storage, keeping food cool in summer and preventing it from freezing in winter. At other sites, there is no evidence of a suspended floor. The pit appears to have been the living surface. In these cases, the floor was simply packed earth, sometimes covered with a layer of clay to create a harder, more water-resistant surface. The depth of the pit varied. Shallow pits, less than a foot deep, may have been primarily for drainage, keeping the interior dry. Deeper pits, up to 5 feet, offered better thermal insulation. The deeper the pit, the more stable the interior temperature. A pit sunk 3 or 4 feet into the ground would remain warmer in winter and cooler in summer than a structure built at ground level. Regional variations suggest different uses. In Anglo-Saxon England, many Grubenhäuser were relatively small and may have served as workshops rather than dwellings. The humid environment of the pit would have been ideal for certain crafts, particularly weaving. Wool and linen fibres remain pliable in humid conditions. If the air is too dry, the fibres become brittle and difficult to work. The natural dampness of the sunken floor would have kept the air inside the structure at an ideal humidity for textile production. In Slavic regions of Central and Eastern Europe, the Grubenhäuser tended to be larger and showed clear evidence of domestic use. These structures contained hearths or ovens, indicating they were lived in year-round. Some of these Eastern European examples were quite sophisticated. Stone or clay ovens were built into one corner of the structure, with a vent running up through the roof. These ovens provided both heat and a place to bake bread. The presence of an oven transformed the interior environment. The oven's thermal mass, the weight of stone or clay, retained heat long after the fire went out. This radiant heat warmed the space throughout the night. In the Isle of Thanet in Kent, archaeologists uncovered a variant of the Grubenhaus that served a communal function. These structures contained large domed ovens with bases made of flint and clay. The ovens were used for baking bread and possibly brewing. The buildings were located near manorial enclosures, suggesting they were not private dwellings, but facilities provided by the local lord for the use of the farmstead. This indicates that subterranean construction was not limited to the poorest levels of society. It was a practical choice for any activity that required stable temperature and protection from the elements. The interior of a Grubenhaus was dark. There were no windows. The only light came from the doorway and the hearth. The hearth was an open fire pit, usually located in the centre of the floor. Smoke rose toward the peak of the roof and permeated the thatch. This had a beneficial side effect. The smoke helped preserve the thatch and deterred insects and rodents, but it also meant the interior was perpetually hazy. The air near the roof was thick with smoke. Anyone moving through the structure learned to stay low, where the air was clearer. Ventilation was passive. As warm air rose, it drew cooler air in through the low doorway. This created a gentle circulation, enough to prevent suffocation, but not enough to clear the smoke entirely. The smell inside would have been strong. Smoke, damp earth, unwashed wool, human bodies. These were the constant background scents of the medieval household. But for the people who lived in these spaces, the smell was not unpleasant. It was familiar. It was the smell of home, of warmth, of safety. The Grubenhaus was not designed for comfort in the modern sense. It was designed for survival. And in the cold, dark winters of northern Europe, it succeeded. The roof of a sod house was not simply a covering. It was a structural element that defined the entire building. Its weight determined how the walls had to be built. Its integrity determined whether the family inside would survive the winter. A completed sod roof could weigh more than 3 tons. This figure is difficult to grasp without context. 3 tons is the weight of a small car, concentrated on a structure with walls made of grass and dirt. The weight came from multiple layers. First, the wooden framework, the ridgepole and rafters, then a layer of brush or small branches to create a surface, then hay or prairie grass to fill gaps. Finally, the sod itself, laid in overlapping courses like shingles. Each layer added a mass. But the sod was the heaviest component. A single brick of prairie sod, 3 feet long and 4 inches thick, weighed 50 pounds or more. A modest roof might require 200 of these bricks. And this was the dry weight. When it rained, the sod absorbed water. The organic matter in the soil acted like a sponge. A roof that weighed 3 tons dry could easily reach 6 tons when saturated. This saturation happened regularly. Spring rains could last for days. Snowmelt added even more moisture. The roof became a reservoir holding hundreds of gallons of water. The wooden rafters had to support this changing load. If the wood was green, recently cut and still full of sap, it was strong but heavy. If it was seasoned, dried for months or years, it was lighter but more brittle. Settlers rarely had access to properly seasoned lumber. They used whatever wood they could find. Cottonwood from river bottoms, willow from creek beds. Occasionally, if they were fortunate, cedar hauled from distant hills. The choice of wood mattered. Cottonwood rots quickly when exposed to moisture. A cottonwood ridgepole might last 3 or 4 years before it weakened. When it failed suddenly. The sound of a roof beginning to fail was distinctive, a creaking that grew louder over hours or days, small bits of dirt falling from the ceiling, cracks appearing in the sod. Families learned to recognise these signs. When they appeared, the household moved carefully. Loud noises, heavy footsteps, anything that added vibration to the structure was avoided. In some cases, the warning was sufficient. The family could evacuate, taking their most valuable possessions. They would sleep outside or with neighbours until the roof could be repaired or rebuilt. In other cases, the collapse came without warning. The family would wake in the night to find the ceiling sagging, or they would return from working in the fields to find the roof had caved in during their absence. If the collapse happened while people were inside, the consequences could be severe. The weight of the falling sod could injure or kill. At minimum, it buried everything in the room: furniture, food stores, bedding. Digging out after a collapse was difficult. The sod had to be removed brick by brick. The damaged rafters had to be extracted. The interior had to be cleared of debris. If the walls remained intact, the structure could be rebuilt. New rafters were installed. New sod was cut and laid. But if the walls had been pushed outward by the force of the collapse, the entire building might be lost. This risk was constant. Every heavy rain brought the possibility of failure. Every winter, snowfall added weight that might exceed the structure's capacity. Settlers developed techniques to manage the risk. Some built internal support posts in the centre of the room. These posts helped carry the weight of the ridgepole, reducing the load on the walls. Others built their roofs with a steeper pitch. A steep roof shed water more quickly, preventing saturation. But a steep roof also required more material and more skilled carpentry. The simplest technique was regular maintenance. After each rain, the roof was inspected. Any low spots where water pooled were built up with additional sod. Any cracks or gaps were filled. This maintenance was not optional. A neglected roof deteriorated rapidly. Small leaks became large ones. Damp spots encouraged rot. Within a year or two, a poorly maintained roof would fail. But even with careful maintenance, the roof was always a source of concern. It represented the boundary between safety and disaster. As long as it held, the family was protected. When it failed, they were exposed. The weight above was more than a physical reality. It was a psychological presence, the knowledge that tons of earth hung over your head while you slept, the awareness that this mass was held in place by nothing more than wooden poles and the binding of grass roots. For some, this awareness was unbearable. They could not relax in the dugout. They felt trapped, buried alive. They moved to frame houses as soon as they could afford to, even though those houses were colder and less protected from the wind. For others, the weight was reassuring. It was mass between them and the elements. It was insulation that kept the heat in and the cold out. It was the reason they survived. The roof aged. Over years, the grass on top continued to grow. The roots extended deeper into the sod, binding it more tightly. The structure became more stable, not less. But the wood beneath continued to decay. Moisture from rain and snow seeped through. The constant cycle of wetting and drying, freezing and thawing weakened the fibres. Eventually, every sod roof reached the end of its life. The wood could no longer bear the load. Replacement was necessary. This replacement was a major undertaking. The old roof had to be removed entirely. New rafters had to be obtained and installed. New sod had to be cut. The work often happened in summer when the weather was favourable, but even in summer the task was exhausting. Families helped each other. Neighbours came together to raise a new roof, knowing that their own would need the same help in time. The roof was the most dangerous part of the structure. It was also the most essential. Without it, the dugout was just a hole in the ground. With it, the dugout became a home. The survival advantage of the dugout was not the result of a single factor. It was the combination of multiple properties working together. Chief among these was thermal mass. Thermal mass refers to a material's ability to absorb, store and release heat. Materials with high thermal mass, like stone, concrete and soil, change temperature slowly. Materials with low thermal mass, like wood or fabric, change temperature quickly. In a surface dwelling with wooden walls, the interior temperature follows the exterior temperature closely. When the air outside drops 20 degrees, the the air inside drops nearly as much within a few hours. But in a dugout with thick earthen walls, the interior temperature barely responds to changes outside. The soil absorbs heat during warmer periods and releases it slowly during colder ones. This creates a kind of temporal averaging. The interior temperature reflects not the current moment, but the average of the past several days or weeks. In practice, this meant that during a sudden cold snap, the dugout remained warm. The walls had absorbed heat during the previous milder weather. They continued to radiate that stored warmth into the interior, compensating for the drop in air temperature. The effect was most pronounced during the worst weather. A blizzard might drop the exterior temperature to 40 below zero. But inside the dugout, the temperature might only fall to 45 degrees. 45 degrees is cold, it is not comfortable, but it is survivable. A small fire, or simply the body heat of several people huddled together, could raise the interior to 60 or 65 degrees. This would not have been possible in a wooden structure. The thin walls would have offered no buffer. The interior would have approached the exterior temperature, forcing the occupants to maintain a large fire continuously. The dugout required less fuel. This was critical on the plains, where fuel was scarce. There was no firewood. Settlers burned dried buffalo dung known as cow chips, or twisted bundles of hay. These fuels burned quickly and produced less heat than wood, but in a dugout they were sufficient. The thermal mass of the walls did most of the work. The fire merely supplemented. The second property that made the dugout effective was its resistance to convective cooling. Convection is the process by which moving air carries heat away from a surface. On the surface, wind is constant. It flows around buildings, through cracks, under doors. Every surface exposed to the wind loses heat. The rate of heat loss increases with wind speed. A wall exposed to a 30-mile-per-hour wind loses heat twice as fast as the same wall in still air. During a blizzard, wind speeds on the plains could reach 60 miles per hour or more. At those speeds, a wooden building became uninhabitable. The wind forced cold air through every gap in the construction. Interior fires were blown out. Temperatures inside dropped to near freezing within hours. But the dugout was immune to wind. The earth absorbed the force of it. The surface might be scoured, but below ground the air was perfectly still. This stillness was one of the most striking features of the dugout interior. Outside, the wind howled. It shook the door. It rattled any loose objects. But inside, nothing moved. The thick walls prevented air infiltration. There were no drafts. The air that entered through the doorway did so slowly, driven only by the temperature difference between inside and outside. This difference created a natural circulation pattern called the stack effect. Warm air near the fire rose toward the ceiling. Cooler air from near the door flowed in to replace it. The circulation was gentle. It provided fresh air without creating drafts. It allowed smoke to exit while preventing heat from escaping rapidly. In a well-constructed dugout, the interior air temperature stratified into layers. The warmest air collected near the ceiling. The coolest air settled near the floor. The middle zone, where people sat and slept, maintained a moderate temperature. This stratification was useful. It meant that standing was warmer than sitting, and sitting was warmer than lying down. But it also meant that the coldest part of the structure was the floor. The floor was earth. In winter, when the ground froze, the floor could become very cold. Families addressed this by covering the floor with layers of straw, rushes, or prairie grass. These organic materials provided insulation between the cold ground and the bodies of the occupants. They also provided cushioning, making the hard earth more comfortable to sit or lie on. The layers accumulated over time. Fresh material was added on top of old. By midwinter, the floor covering might be 6 inches thick or more. This thick mat had its own thermal properties. It trapped air between the stems and leaves. Air is an excellent insulator. The mat created a barrier that slowed heat loss from bodies to the ground. The combination of thermal mass in the walls and insulation on the floor made the dugout remarkably efficient. Very little heat input was needed to maintain livable conditions. Historical accounts describe families surviving severe cold with only a small fire burning for a few hours each evening. The rest of the time, the dugout held its temperature through thermal inertia alone. This efficiency was not intuitive. Visitors to the plains, seeing the crude appearance of the dugouts, often assumed they would be miserably cold. Some expressed pity for the families living in them, but the occupants knew better. They had lived through winters in both dugouts and frame houses. They understood which was warmer. One settler wrote that after spending a winter in a newly built frame house, the family returned to their old dugout. The frame house, despite having windows and a wooden floor, was unbearably cold. The wind penetrated every wall. Snow drifted through cracks. The stove had to burn constantly. The dugout, by contrast, required only a small fire at dusk. The temperature remained steady through the night. The family slept comfortably under wool blankets, while outside the temperature dropped below zero. This was not sentiment. It was thermodynamics. The dugout worked because it utilised the properties of the earth, its mass, its stability, its impermeability to wind. It was not elegant. It was not beautiful, but it was warm. And in winter, warmth was the only thing that mattered. Wind on the Great Plains was not merely an inconvenience. It was a force that shaped the landscape and tested every structure humans built upon it. The plains stretched for hundreds of miles without significant elevation change. There were no mountain ranges to block or deflect moving air, no forests to slow it down. The wind moved across this flatness without resistance. In winter, this wind carried cold air from the Arctic. It moved at speeds that would be considered dangerous in most climates. Sustained winds of 30 to 40 miles per hour were common. Gusts could exceed 60. At these speeds, wind ceased to be merely fast-moving air. It became a physical force capable of pushing over animals, tearing roofs from buildings and making it nearly impossible for a person to stand upright. The effect on structures was profound. A wooden building, even one well constructed, flexed and creaked under the assault. Boards separated slightly at the joints. Gaps appeared. The wind found these gaps and exploited them. Cold air forced its way through, driven by the pressure difference between the windward and leeward sides of the building. The interior filled with drafts. Temperatures dropped. Settlers called this phenomenon the wind coming through. It was not a figure of speech. You could feel the wind inside the house, moving from one wall to another, stealing heat from any surface it touched. Efforts to seal the gaps were only partially successful. Cloth was stuffed into cracks, mud was applied to joints, but the constant flexing of the structure under wind pressure kept opening new gaps. Some frame houses were lined with newspaper on the interior walls. The paper provided a slight barrier against air infiltration. Families collected newspapers for months to accumulate enough to cover the walls. Even with these measures, the frame house remained cold. The thin walls, often just a single layer of boards, had minimal thermal mass. They transmitted cold from outside to inside almost immediately. The situation was worse in sod houses built above ground. These structures had thick walls which should have provided good insulation, but the wind exploited any weakness in the construction. Sod bricks, even when carefully laid, did not form a perfectly airtight seal. Small gaps existed between the bricks. The wind found these gaps and forced cold air through. As the sod dried over the winter, it shrank slightly. This shrinkage created additional cracks. The wind pressure widened these cracks, making the problem worse. In a severe windstorm, occupants of above-ground sod houses reported feeling the wind inside. Not just drafts, but actual moving air strong enough to flutter clothing and disturb papers. The dugout avoided this problem entirely. The walls were not constructed of stacked bricks. They were monolithic earth, solid, continuous, without gaps or joints. The wind could not penetrate because there was nothing to penetrate. The earth was dense, compressed by its own weight, and the weight of the hill above. Air does not move through solid earth. It cannot. The particles are too tightly packed. There is no pathway for the air to follow. This impermeability created a boundary between two entirely different environments. Outside, the wind raged. Inside, the air was still. The contrast was stark. A person could stand at the doorway of a dugout and experience both environments simultaneously. On one side of the threshold, the wind threatened to knock them over. On the other side, a few feet into the dugout, the air was motionless. This stillness was more than comfort. It was a survival mechanism. Moving air carries heat away from the body through convection. Still air allows the body to maintain a warm layer of air against the skin. In still air, a person can remain comfortable at temperatures that would be dangerous in moving air. 50 degrees with no wind is tolerable. 50 degrees with 30-mile-per-hour wind induces hypothermia. The dugout provided that stillness. Once the door was closed, the interior environment was isolated from the exterior. The wind could blow for days without affecting the temperature inside. This isolation extended to sound as well. Wind creates noise through its interaction with objects. Trees, buildings, anything that can vibrate or whistle. On the treeless plains, the wind sound came from the grass itself, millions of stems vibrating in unison, creating a sustained roar. In a frame house, this sound was ever present. The walls transmitted it. The roof amplified it. Sleep became difficult because the noise never stopped. In the dugout, the sound was absorbed by the earth. The thick walls dampened vibrations before they reached the interior. The result was an almost unnatural quiet. Families reported that during blizzards, when they knew the wind outside was at its strongest, they could barely hear it. The dugout felt removed from the storm, as if it existed in a separate, calmer world. This acoustic isolation had psychological effects. The constant noise of wind creates stress. It prevents rest. It makes people irritable and anxious. The quiet of the dugout allowed the mind to settle. Sleep came more easily. Children were calmer. The family could speak in normal tones without shouting over the wind. There were moments during severe storms when the only indication that a blizzard was happening came from the door. If someone needed to go outside, to check on animals or retrieve something from storage, opening the door was a shock. The calm interior gave way to chaos. Snow blew in immediately, the temperature dropped. The noise was overwhelming. Then the door closed and the calm returned. This transition emphasized how effective the barrier was. The earth was not just blocking wind. It was creating a refuge, a protected space where normal life could continue despite the violence outside. The wind could not reach the dugout's occupants. It could not steal their heat. It could not disturb their rest. The earth stood between them and the storm, and the earth did not move. Winter days on the plains were short. By late December, the sun set before 5 in the evening. Darkness lasted 15 hours or more. In a surface dwelling with windows, this darkness could be managed with lamps and candles. The light from a flame, though dim, reflected off walls and provided enough visibility for basic tasks. But the dugout had few windows, sometimes none at all. Once the sun set, the interior became profoundly dark. This darkness required preparation. Tasks that needed light had to be completed while daylight remained. Anything left undone would have to wait until morning, or be attempted by feel alone. The rhythm of the day adjusted accordingly. Families rose with the sun, often before dawn, to maximize the hours of usable light. The morning was spent on tasks that required precision or careful observation. Cooking, mending, any sort of handwork. These were morning activities. By afternoon, attention shifted to preparation for the coming darkness. Fuel had to be gathered and brought inside. On the plains, this meant collecting dried buffalo dung or cutting and twisting bundles of hay. The amount needed depended on how cold the night was expected to be. A severe cold snap required more fuel. The fire would burn longer, consuming more material. Running out of fuel in the middle of the night was dangerous. The temperature inside could drop rapidly once the fire went out. Fuel was stored near the hearth or stove within easy reach. This allowed someone to add fuel without having to navigate across the dark interior. Water was also brought in. Wells or streams might be some distance from the dugout. Hauling water in darkness was difficult and potentially dangerous, especially if ice had formed. Enough water was stored inside to last through the night and into the next morning. This water was kept near the fire to prevent freezing. Food for the evening meal was prepared while light remained. Ingredients were measured, vegetables cut, bread sliced. Once darkness fell, the actual cooking could proceed by firelight, but the preparation was already done. The animals required attention. Livestock had to be fed and secured. On the plains, cattle and horses were sometimes brought close to the dugout or even inside a connected shelter. This proximity served multiple purposes. It allowed the family to check on the animals during the night if needed. It also provided additional warmth. The body heat of a cow or horse contributed to raising the ambient temperature. In medieval Grubenhäuser, it was common for animals to share the structure with the family during the coldest months. One end of the building housed the people, the other end housed the livestock. The smell was strong, but the warmth was valuable. A single cow could raise the interior temperature by several degrees. In a space where every degree mattered, this was significant. Once the animals were settled, attention turned to securing the structure itself. The door was the primary point of heat loss. It was checked to ensure it fit tightly in its frame. Gaps around the door were stuffed with rags or straw. Some families hung a heavy blanket or hide over the interior side of the door to create an additional barrier. Windows, if present, were covered. A piece of cloth or a wooden shutter blocked the glass, preventing cold air from radiating inward. The fire was built up. If the family used a stove, it was stoked with fuel to create a bed of coals that would last through the evening. If they cooked over an open hearth, the fire was carefully maintained. The goal was to establish a steady, sustainable burn. Too large a fire wasted fuel. Too small a fire provided insufficient heat. Experienced settlers could judge the fire by feel and sound. They knew how much fuel to add and when to add it to maintain the optimal temperature. As darkness settled, the family gathered near the fire. This was the centre of the space, the source of heat and light. Activity contracted to this small area. Work that could be done by firelight continued. Sewing, knitting, carving. Simple tasks that required attention but not bright illumination. Conversation happened, stories were told, children listened. The oral transmission of family history and community knowledge occurred in these hours. The fire's light created a boundary. Everything within its reach was visible, though dimly. Everything beyond faded into shadow. The far corners of the dugout disappeared. Objects stored there became vague shapes. The ceiling, if visible during the day, became a black void. This compression of space was both practical and psychological. The family's world shrank to what the fire illuminated. Everything else ceased to matter until morning. As the evening progressed, the fire was allowed to burn down. Fuel was conserved for the deeper cold of the night. The interior temperature dropped slightly, but the thermal mass of the walls compensated. Bedding was prepared. Straw grass was spread on the sleeping area. Blankets and hides were laid out. The arrangement was deliberate, designed to maximize warmth. The youngest children were placed in the centre. Their smaller bodies lost heat more quickly. Surrounding them with larger bodies helped maintain their temperature. Parents and older children positioned themselves on the outer edges. This arrangement also allowed adults to respond quickly if something required attention during the night. Before sleep, a final check was made. The fire was banked, covered with ash to slow its burning. This allowed coals to survive until morning without consuming all the remaining fuel. The door was tested one last time. Any sound from outside was noted. A rising wind, the movement of animals, anything unusual. Then the family settled into the darkness. The fire's glow faded. The last traces of light disappeared. The dugout became a space of pure black. And in that darkness, surrounded by earth, the family slept. The interior of a dugout or Grubenhaus was not large. Typical dimensions ranged from 10 to 16 feet in length and 8 to 12 feet in width. This space contained everything the family owned and everything they needed to survive the winter. There was no separation of functions, no division into rooms. This single space had to serve as kitchen, workshop, storage area and bedroom. Each function occupied a particular zone within the room, and these zones were determined by proximity to heat and light. The fire was the organising principle. In most dugouts, the hearth or stove was located near the centre of the space, slightly toward the front where the door provided ventilation. This placement allowed heat to radiate in all directions. It also positioned the fire near the source of fresh air, ensuring that smoke could escape through the door or a vent in the roof. The area immediately around the fire was the warmest. This is where the family spent their waking hours during cold weather. Seating, often just logs, stones, or simple stools, was arranged in a semicircle. Food preparation happened in this zone. Pots hung over the fire or sat on the stove. Ingredients were kept within arm's reach. Water, stored in buckets or barrels, was positioned close enough to remain liquid. Beyond the immediate fire zone, the temperature dropped. The far corners of the room, especially those farthest from the door and fire, were the coldest. These cold zones became storage areas. Food that benefited from cool temperatures, root vegetables, preserved meats, dairy products, was kept here. In a Grubenhaus with a suspended floor, the pit beneath served this purpose. The space under the floorboards remained cool year-round, functioning as a natural cellar. Items that needed to stay dry were elevated. Shelves, if the family could construct them, lined the walls. These held clothing, tools, and any valuables. The walls themselves were used for storage. Pegs driven into the sod or the wooden frame held coats, bags, and bundles of dried herbs or grass. The ceiling, in structures tall enough, also served this purpose. Ropes strung across the space supported drying food, wet clothing, or bundles of materials that needed to be kept off the floor. The sleeping area was carefully positioned. It needed to be close enough to the fire to benefit from residual heat, but far enough away to avoid smoke and the risk of fire spreading. In most dugouts, the sleeping area occupied one end of the room. A raised platform, if one existed, separated the sleepers from the cold ground. If no platform could be built, the floor was simply covered with thick layers of straw. The platform, when present, was a simple construction. Logs or planks laid across stones or wooden supports created a surface 6 inches to a foot above the ground. This elevation provided significant benefit. Cold air settles. The lowest part of any room is the coldest. Raising the sleeping surface even slightly moved the sleepers into warmer air. The platform also kept the bedding dry. The earth floor, despite being packed hard, could become damp from condensation or seepage. Wet bedding loses its insulating properties and can lead to illness. Straw or grass was piled on the platform to create a mattress. This material compressed over time, requiring periodic replacement or the addition of fresh layers. On top of the straw, blankets and hides were laid. Wool blankets were common in medieval Europe. On the American frontier, buffalo hides were prized above all else. The hollow structure of buffalo hair traps air more effectively than wool. A single buffalo hide could provide warmth equivalent to 3 or 4 wool blankets. These materials were heavy. The weight helped keep them in place and prevented drafts from penetrating, but it also made the bedding difficult to move or clean. The bedding accumulated dirt, insects, and debris. Periodically, usually in spring, it was taken outside, beaten and aired, but during the winter months it remained in place, gradually becoming a dense insulating mass. The spatial organisation of the dugout reflected practical needs, but also created social patterns. Proximity to the fire indicated status and vulnerability. The elderly and the very young, being most susceptible to cold, occupied the positions closest to warmth. Adults in their prime, capable of withstanding greater cold, positioned themselves farther out. This arrangement was not discussed or negotiated. It was simply how things were done. The family organised itself according to the logic of survival. Movement within the space was limited. The low ceiling in many structures prevented standing except in the very centre. People crouched, sat, or moved in a stooped position. This restriction meant that most activities happened from a seated position. Work surfaces were low. Tools were kept within reach of where they would be used. The floor, despite being earth, became a defined landscape. Certain areas were for walking, others were not to be disturbed. The family learned this geography through daily repetition. In darkness, this knowledge became essential. When the fire provided only dim light, or had gone out entirely, people navigated by memory. They knew where each object was, where the safe paths lay. A visitor, entering the dugout for the first time, would have found it confusing. The dark interior, the low ceiling, the seemingly random placement of objects. But for the family, every element had its place. The space was organised with precision, even if that organisation was invisible to outsiders. This precision was necessary. In a space so small, disorder meant inefficiency. Inefficiency meant wasted time, wasted fuel, wasted warmth. The dugout was not comfortable in any modern sense. It was cramped, dark, and smelled of earth and smoke. But it was organised, it was functional, and it kept the family alive. Light in the dugout was a precious and limited resource. The thick earthen walls that provided such effective insulation also blocked nearly all natural illumination. A window, when present, was small. Glass was expensive and fragile. Transporting it across the plains without breakage required careful packing and added to the cost. A single pane might measure 12 inches square, perhaps slightly larger if the family could afford it. This small opening admitted a narrow shaft of daylight, but the light did not spread far. The window was set into a wall 2 to 3 feet thick. The depth of this recess created a tunnel effect. Light entered at an angle, illuminating only a small portion of the interior. The rest of the room remained in shadow even at midday. The corners were perpetually dim. The ceiling, if visible at all, appeared as a vague, dark mass overhead. In medieval Grubenhäuser, windows were even rarer. Many structures had none. The doorway provided the only natural light, and that only when the door stood open. During cold weather, the door remained closed. Opening it meant losing heat. The family accepted the darkness as the price of warmth. Artificial light came from fire. In the simplest structures, the hearth provided the only illumination. The flames cast moving shadows, creating a restless, flickering environment. This light was warm in colour but dim in intensity. It was sufficient to see shapes and movement but not fine details. Close work, sewing, carving, any task requiring precision, became difficult or impossible once the sun set. Some families used oil lamps or candles to supplement the firelight. These were luxury items, reserved for special occasions or essential tasks that could not wait until morning. Oil lamps burned rendered animal fat or, more rarely, plant oils. The fuel had to be prepared in advance. Fat was collected from butchered animals, heated to separate it from tissue, and stored in containers. A simple lamp consisted of a shallow dish filled with this fat and a twisted fibre wick. The wick drew the liquefied fat upward through capillary action, feeding the flame. The light from such a lamp was weak. It illuminated a small area, perhaps a foot or 2 in radius. Multiple lamps were needed to light even a modest space, and few families could afford the fuel for more than one. Candles were even more expensive. They required tallow or beeswax, both of which had other uses. Tallow could be made into soap. Beeswax was valuable for waterproofing and preservation. Using these materials for candles meant sacrificing their use elsewhere. Most families reserved candles for situations where firelight was insufficient, and the task could not be postponed. The scarcity of light shaped the rhythm of life. Work that required vision was scheduled for daylight hours. As the afternoon progressed and natural light began to fail, tasks shifted to those that could be done by touch or memory. Food preparation moved to the fire where the flames provided enough light to work by. Conversation increased as activity decreased. The family gathered closer, drawn together by the small circle of illumination. Children learned to navigate the dark interior by feel. They memorized the location of objects, the layout of the space. This knowledge allowed them to move safely when light was minimal. Adults developed similar skills. They could tend the fire, retrieve items, even prepare simple meals in near-total darkness. Fingers learned to distinguish textures, shapes, and temperatures. This adaptation was not unique to the dugout. Humans throughout history have lived with limited light. But the dugout's darkness was particularly profound because the walls blocked all ambient light. In a wooden structure, even without windows, some light might seep through gaps in the construction. Moonlight or starlight could create faint illumination. In the dugout, no such seepage occurred. The earth walls were opaque. Once the fire died and the door closed, the darkness was absolute. This darkness affected sleep patterns. Without external light cues, the body's circadian rhythm relied on other signals: temperature, routine, hunger. Families went to bed shortly after sunset, not because they were necessarily tired, but because there was little else to do in the darkness. They woke with the first hint of dawn, when the faintest change in the darkness indicated morning's approach. This schedule meant that winter sleep was long. 15 or 16 hours of darkness meant the possibility of 12 or more hours of rest. Whether people actually slept that entire time is unclear. Historical accounts suggest intermittent waking, periods of quiet conversation in the dark, and the practice of tending the fire in shifts. The lack of light also affected mental state. Prolonged darkness can lead to feelings of confinement, even depression. The unchanging environment becomes oppressive. Some settlers described a profound relief at the return of spring, when days lengthened and the door could be left open. The admission of daylight transformed the interior, revealing details that had been hidden for months. Dust that had settled on surfaces became visible. The true colour of objects emerged. The space that had seemed so small and enclosed in darkness appeared larger and more defined in light. But during the winter months, the family accepted the darkness. It was not pleasant, but it was temporary. The sun would return. The days would lengthen. In the meantime, they conserved fuel, husbanded their small supply of lamp oil and lived by firelight. They moved carefully in the shadows. They learned the geography of their home by touch. And they waited for morning, when the door could open again and daylight, however briefly, would push back the dark. Privacy, as a concept, did not exist in the winter dugout. The single room contained the entire household, and at night, that household slept together in a shared space. The idea of separate beds for each family member was a luxury beyond reach. Beds themselves, in the modern sense, were rare. What existed was a sleeping area, a designated portion of the floor, or a raised platform where the family rested. This area was not large. A typical platform might measure 6 feet by 8 feet, or 10 feet if the family was larger. Into this space, 4, 5, sometimes 6 or more people arranged themselves for the night. The arrangement followed a pattern. It was not random. Each person had a position determined by age, size, and vulnerability to cold. The smallest children occupied the centre. Their bodies were compact, their surface area to mass ratio high. They lost heat more quickly than adults. Placing them in the middle surrounded them with the warmth of larger bodies. Parents and older siblings positioned themselves on the outer edges. They formed a protective layer, a buffer between the youngest members and the colder air at the perimeter. This arrangement was sometimes called pigging, a term that evoked the way piglets huddle against the sow for warmth. The comparison was not meant to be derogatory. It was simply descriptive of the practice. The orientation of bodies mattered. People often slept on their sides, facing the same direction. This allowed them to fit more closely together, minimizing gaps where cold air could penetrate. When one person shifted position during the night, others might shift as well, maintaining the compact formation. This happened unconsciously, a collective adjustment to preserve warmth. The bedding materials were chosen for their insulating properties. Straw or dried grass formed the base layer. These materials compressed under weight but retained enough loft to trap air. Air trapped in small pockets is an excellent insulator. It cannot conduct heat effectively because there is no mass to transfer it. The more air the bedding could trap, the better it performed. On top of the straw, wool blankets were layered. Wool retains its insulating properties even when damp, a crucial advantage in the humid interior of the dugout. Buffalo hides, when available, were placed over the wool. The hide's weight helped seal the edges of the bedding, preventing drafts from penetrating. The hollow structure of buffalo hair provided superior insulation. A single buffalo hide could make the difference between comfort and suffering. Families who owned multiple hides were considered fortunate. Those with only wool had to rely on greater numbers of blankets or additional layers of clothing. Clothing was not removed for sleep. People slept fully dressed, often in the same garments they had worn during the day. Removing clothing would have meant exposing the body to cold air even briefly, which would lower core temperature. Additional items were sometimes added. Coats might be laid over the blankets. Extra shawls or scarves were wrapped around heads or shoulders. Anything that could add another layer of insulation was used. The combined effect of multiple bodies, layered bedding, and retained clothing was the creation of a microclimate. Under the blankets and hides, the temperature could reach 70 or 80 degrees, even when the surrounding air in the dugout was only 45 or 50. This warmth was generated entirely by metabolic heat, the energy released by living bodies as they maintained their internal functions. No external heat source was needed. The concentration of this heat in a small enclosed space was efficient. Heat radiated from each body, absorbed by adjacent bodies, and reflected back by the blankets above. But this efficiency came with trade-offs. The air under the blankets became stale. carbon dioxide from breathing accumulated, the space smelled strongly of sweat and unwashed bodies. Bathing in winter was rare. Water had to be heated over the fire, a process that consumed fuel. The cold air made undressing unpleasant and potentially dangerous. Most people went weeks or months without washing more than their hands and face. This meant that the bedding absorbed oils, dirt, and dead skin. Over the course of a winter, the blankets and hides became progressively dirtier. They were also shared with other organisms. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs found the warm, dark environment ideal. These parasites fed on the sleeping family, causing itching and discomfort. There was no effective way to eliminate them during the winter. The bedding could not be washed or aired without risking its loss to weather. Families endured the presence of these pests as an unavoidable aspect of winter life. In spring, when the weather warmed, the bedding was taken outside. It was beaten to remove dust and debris. It was spread in the sun, which helped kill some of the parasites. But complete elimination was impossible. The pests reinfested from clothing, from the walls, from stored materials. They were a constant presence. The sleeping arrangement also meant that illness spread quickly. If one family member developed a cough or fever, others soon followed. The close contact and shared air ensured transmission. This was understood but unavoidable. Isolating a sick person would have meant denying them the warmth of the communal bed, which could worsen their condition. The family accepted the risk of contagion as preferable to the certainty of cold. Children grew up with no expectation of sleeping alone. The presence of others was normal. The sounds of breathing, the occasional cough or shift of position, these were the background of sleep. For adults, especially those who had known different arrangements before moving to the frontier, the adjustment could be difficult. The loss of privacy, the constant physical proximity, these could feel like indignities. But necessity overrode preference. Survival required shared warmth. Individual comfort was subordinated to collective need. And over time, the arrangement became familiar. The presence of family members close at hand provided a sense of security. In the isolated darkness of the dugout, knowing that others were within reach was reassuring. The communal bed was not a choice. It was a technology, as essential to winter survival as the thick walls or the banked fire. It transformed the family into a single thermal unit, pooling their collective heat to create a refuge within a refuge. The dugout protected them from the wind and cold. The communal bed protected them from the chill that remained. Together, these elements made it possible to sleep through the long, dark nights without freezing. The bedding used in the dugout was not arbitrary. Each material was chosen for specific properties related to heat retention and moisture management. Straw formed the foundation layer. It was readily available, especially after harvest. The dried stalks were cut and spread across the sleeping platform or directly on the earth floor. Straw's value lay in its structure. Each hollow stem trapped a small column of air. When many stems were packed together, they created a matrix of air pockets. This structure provided two benefits. First, it insulated against the cold ground. The trapped air prevented heat from conducting downward into the earth. Second, it created a cushioning layer that made the hard surface more comfortable. The thickness of the straw layer varied. In the coldest months, it might be built up to 6 or 8 inches. As the family slept on it night after night, the straw compressed, reducing its effectiveness. Fresh straw was added periodically to maintain the loft. The old compressed straw was not removed. It remained beneath, adding mass and further insulating the sleeping area from the ground. By spring, the accumulated straw could be a foot thick or more. It formed a kind of mattress, conforming to the shapes of the sleepers and moulding itself to the irregularities of the floor beneath. This straw was also home to insects and small rodents. Mice burrowed into it, seeking warmth and food. Beetles and other arthropods lived in the lower layers, feeding on grain fragments and organic debris. The family tolerated this cohabitation. Attempts to remove the pests would have required replacing all the straw, a major undertaking in the middle of winter. On top of the straw, cloth layers were added when available. Linen sheets, cotton fabric, even old clothing that was too worn for daily use. These layers created a smoother surface and helped contain the straw, preventing it from poking through. Wool blankets were the primary insulating layer. Wool has unique properties that made it essential for cold weather survival. Unlike plant fibres, wool retains warmth even when wet. The crimped structure of wool fibres creates air spaces that persist even in the presence of moisture. This meant that a wool blanket remained functional, even if it absorbed condensation from breath or body heat. Wool also wicks moisture away from the skin. When people sleep, they perspire. In a tightly enclosed space like the communal bed, this moisture can accumulate. Wool absorbs this moisture and moves it toward the outer surface of the blanket, where it can evaporate. This property prevented the bedding from becoming damp against the skin, which would have caused rapid heat loss. The number of wool blankets a family owned varied with their economic status. A prosperous household might have 4 or 5. A poorer family might have only 1 or 2, supplemented with whatever else could be found. In medieval Europe, cloaks served as blankets. During the day, they were worn for warmth. At night, they were spread over the sleeping area. This dual use was practical and economical. Heavy woolen cloaks, made from thick, tightly woven fabric, provided substantial insulation. Multiple cloaks layered together could substitute for dedicated blankets. Buffalo hides represented the pinnacle of cold weather bedding on the American frontier. The hide of a mature buffalo was large enough to cover several people. The hair of the buffalo is hollow. This structure creates millions of tiny air chambers, each one acting as an insulator. The effect is similar to modern synthetic insulation, but superior in many ways. A buffalo hide was heavy, often weighing 20 to 30 pounds. This weight helped it stay in place and sealed the edges of the bedding, preventing drafts. The hide also served as a windbreak. If placed as the outermost layer, it blocked any air movement within the sleeping area, ensuring that the warm air generated by the bodies remained trapped beneath. Obtaining buffalo hides became more difficult as the 19th century progressed. The mass slaughter of buffalo herds for commercial purposes drastically reduced their numbers. By the 1880s, buffalo were nearly extinct on the plains. Families who had acquired hides before the collapse of the herds guarded them carefully. A good buffalo hide could last for years if properly maintained. Maintenance involved periodic airing and beating to remove dust and parasites. The hide could not be washed, as water would damage the leather. Instead, it was scraped clean and rubbed with fat to keep the leather supple. When buffalo hides were unavailable, families used cattle hides, though these were inferior. Cattle hair is solid, not hollow, providing less insulation. The hides were also smaller, requiring multiple hides to cover the same area. Deerskin and other animal pelts were used when available. Rabbit fur, though less durable, was prized for its softness and warmth. Multiple rabbit pelts could be sewn together to create a blanket-sized covering. In the poorest households, bedding might consist of nothing more than straw and old clothing. Coats, dresses, shirts, anything made of fabric was piled on top of the sleepers. This improvised bedding was less effective than wool or hides, but it was better than nothing. The key was mass. The more layers, the more air was trapped, the warmer the sleepers remained. Children sometimes slept in the middle, wrapped in additional layers. A child might be bundled in a wool dress or coat, then placed under the communal blankets. This extra protection compensated for their smaller body size and higher heat loss. The edges of the bedding were tucked under the sleepers. This created a sealed envelope, minimizing the entry of cold air from the surrounding room. Getting into this arrangement required a coordinated effort. The blankets had to be lifted, the children positioned, the adults arranged, and then the blankets drawn back over everyone. Once settled, movement was discouraged. Shifting position could let cold air in or disrupt the arrangement, reducing the overall warmth. The bedding was not removed during the day, it remained in place, ready for the next night's use. Folding and storing it would have been impractical, and would have allowed the residual warmth to dissipate. Over the course of the winter, the bedding absorbed the smells and moisture of daily life. It became heavy with use, saturated with the presence of the people who slept beneath it. But it worked. Night after night it kept the family warm. The materials, layered and arranged according to practical knowledge, passed down through generations, created a system that functioned even in the most severe cold. Without these materials, without wool and hide and straw, survival would not have been possible. The dugout provided the structure. The bedding provided the final essential layer of protection. Together they formed a complete system of thermal management, one that required no external fuel beyond the metabolic heat of living bodies. The human body, at rest, generates approximately 100 watts of thermal energy. This is the result of metabolic processes, the conversion of food into energy, the maintenance of cellular functions, the operation of organs. In warm climates, this heat is a burden. The body must expel it to avoid overheating. Sweating, increased blood flow to the skin, and respiration all serve to dissipate excess thermal energy. But in cold environments, this same heat becomes a resource. It is not sufficient by itself to maintain comfort. A single person in a large cold space will lose heat faster than the body can generate it. However, when multiple bodies are confined in a small insulated space, the collective heat output becomes significant. 6 people, each generating 100 watts, produce 600 watts of thermal energy. This is equivalent to a modest space heater. If this energy is prevented from escaping, if it is trapped within an insulated enclosure, the temperature of that space will rise until equilibrium is reached. The communal bed in the dugout was designed to trap this heat. The layers of wool, hide and straw created a barrier that slowed heat loss. The close proximity of bodies reduced the surface area from which heat could radiate into the surrounding air. The result was a microclimate under the blankets that was significantly warmer than the ambient air of the dugout. Even when the room temperature was 40 degrees, the space beneath the bedding could reach 70 or 80 degrees. This warmth was not immediate. When the family first settled into the bed, the blankets were cold. Heat had to be transferred from the bodies to the bedding materials, warming them gradually. This process took time, perhaps 20 or 30 minutes. During this period, the sleepers felt cold. They drew their limbs close to their bodies, minimizing exposed surface area. They breathed shallowly to avoid inhaling cold air deeply, but as the bedding warmed, discomfort lessened. The blankets began to radiate the stored heat back toward the bodies. The air trapped beneath became warm and still. The physics of this system relied on the low thermal conductivity of the bedding materials. Wool and hide do not transfer heat quickly. This means that once warmed, they hold that warmth for extended periods. If a sleeper shifted position, briefly exposing part of the bedding to cold air, the material did not cool immediately. The thermal mass of the wool and hide resisted rapid temperature change. This resistance provided stability. The microclimate under the blankets remained relatively constant throughout the night, even though the fire in the room might burn down and the ambient temperature might drop. The arrangement of bodies within the bed also mattered. Smaller bodies, particularly children, lost heat more quickly because of their higher surface area to volume ratio. By placing these smaller bodies in the centre, surrounded by larger ones, the system compensated for this vulnerability. The adults' bodies acted as radiant heaters, transferring warmth to the children without conscious effort. This transfer occurred through radiation and conduction. Radiant heat moved through the small air gaps between bodies. Conduction transferred heat at points of direct contact. A child's back against a parent's chest, an arm draped over a shoulder. The collective heat also warmed the air within the enclosed space. This warm air was less dense than the cold air outside the blankets. It remained trapped beneath the covers, rising only slightly toward the top layers of bedding. Breathing contributed both heat and moisture to this environment. Each exhaled breath carried warmth from the lungs and water vapour from respiration. In a sealed space, this moisture would have accumulated, making the bedding damp, but the wool absorbed it, wicking it away from the faces and bodies of the sleepers. The moisture then migrated toward the outer layers of the bedding, where it encountered colder air. Some of it condensed, releasing latent heat in the process. This small additional heat source helped maintain the temperature of the outer blanket layers. The system was not without limits. If too many people crowded into too small a space, the temperature could become uncomfortable. The air could become stifling, making sleep difficult. Conversely, if the space was too large or the bedding too thin, the collective heat was insufficient. The sleepers would feel cold all night, unable to reach thermal equilibrium. Families learned through experience the optimal arrangement for their particular circumstances. They adjusted the number of blankets, the tightness of the sleeping formation, and the degree to which they sealed the edges of the bedding. This knowledge was practical, not theoretical. No one calculated thermal conductivity or metabolic heat output. They simply knew what worked. If a family member was ill and running a fever, their elevated body temperature contributed additional heat. This could be beneficial if the night was especially cold, but it could also make the environment too warm for the other sleepers. In such cases, the feverish person might be positioned at the edge of the bed, where some of their excess heat could dissipate. Elderly family members, whose metabolic rate was often lower, benefited most from the central positions. Their bodies generated less heat, making them more dependent on warmth from others. Infants presented a unique challenge. Their small size meant they could easily become overheated if buried too deeply in the bedding. But they also lost heat rapidly if exposed. Mothers often kept infants close to their own bodies, using their own thermal regulation to moderate the infant's temperature. The infant was tucked inside the mother's clothing, or wrapped in additional layers, then held against her chest. This practice, known as bundling, was common across many cold climate cultures. It allowed the infant to benefit from the mother's body heat while preventing overheating. The technology of body heat was not dramatic. It did not involve invention or innovation in the conventional sense. It was simply the application of observed principles, that bodies generate heat, that materials can trap that heat, that proximity amplifies the effect. But this simple technology was foundational. Without it, the dugout would have been uninhabitable on the coldest nights. The thick walls and stable earth temperature could keep the interior above, freezing, but they could not make it comfortable. The communal bed, fueled by nothing more than the metabolic output of the family, provided the final increment of warmth necessary for survival. It was a technology of intimacy, requiring trust and acceptance of physical closeness. It was a technology of cooperation, where each person contributed to the warmth of all, and it worked. Night after night, winter after winter, families slept in warmth generated by their own bodies, preserved by layers of wool and hide, in a space carved from the earth. Sound behaves differently underground than it does on the surface. The thick, dense walls of the dugout absorbed acoustic energy, preventing its transmission. This created an interior soundscape that was profoundly quiet, even when the world outside was chaotic. On the open plains, wind created constant noise. It moved across the grass, producing a sustained hiss or roar depending on its speed. In winter, when the grass was dry and brittle, the sound intensified. During a blizzard, the wind could reach speeds that generated a noise level comparable to standing beside a highway. The air itself seemed to scream. In a wooden structure, this noise penetrated. The walls vibrated in response to the wind. Boards creaked and flexed. Gaps in the construction acted as channels, funneling sound into the interior. Occupants of frame houses during severe storms reported being unable to sleep because of the noise. Conversation was difficult. Shouting was necessary to be heard across the room. But in the dugout the noise vanished. The earth absorbed the acoustic energy before it could reach the interior. Sound waves are mechanical vibrations. They require a medium, air, water, solid material to propagate. When a sound wave encounters a dense, massive barrier like 3 feet of soil, most of its energy is absorbed. The particles of soil vibrate slightly in response to the wave, but the energy dissipates as heat. Very little passes through to the other side. The result was that even during the most violent windstorms, the interior of the dugout remained nearly silent. Occupants could hear their own breathing, the crackle of the fire, the small sounds of movement. But the roar of the wind was absent. It was as if the storm did not exist. This acoustic isolation had psychological effects. The contrast between knowing intellectually that a blizzard was raging and experiencing complete silence created a sense of unreality. Families sometimes checked the door during storms, partly to ensure it remained secure, but also to confirm that the wind was indeed still blowing. Opening the door brought an immediate assault of noise and cold, proving that the silence inside was not the silence of calm but the silence of insulation. Then the door closed and the quiet returned. This silence extended to sounds from outside the immediate vicinity. Voices, animal calls, the movement of wagons or people, none of these reached the interior if they were more than a few feet from the door. This created a sense of isolation. The family in the dugout was cut off not just visually, but acoustically from the world beyond. For some, this was comforting. The dugout became a sealed refuge, a place apart. The silence allowed rest, concentration, and quiet conversation. For others, especially those unaccustomed to such isolation, the silence was oppressive. The lack of external sound made the interior feel like a tomb. The awareness of being surrounded by earth, cut off from the sky and the horizon, created anxiety. Children born on the frontier, who had known no other home, adapted to the silence easily. It was simply how indoor space sounded to them. Adults who had lived in towns or villages before moving to the plains sometimes struggled. They missed the ambient sounds of community, distant voices, dogs barking, the clatter of wagons. The interior sounds of the dugout were subtle. The fire made a range of noises depending on the fuel and the state of the burn. Dry buffalo chips produced a soft crackling. Hay twists burned with a brief, bright hiss. When the fire was banked for the night, covered with ash to preserve the coals, it made almost no sound. The faint glow provided no acoustic accompaniment. Breathing was audible. In the close quarters of the communal bed, each person could hear the inhalations and exhalations of those nearby. This became part of the rhythm of sleep. The sound of breathing indicated that everyone was alive, that the night was passing normally. Changes in breathing, a cough, a gasp, laboured respiration, were immediately noticeable and could indicate illness or distress. Movement created sound. The rustle of straw, the creak of the sleeping platform if one existed, the soft thud of a body shifting position. These sounds were magnified in the silence. People learned to move quietly to avoid disturbing others. This consideration was practical, not merely polite. Waking others disrupted the collective rest, and could make the remaining hours of the night uncomfortable for everyone. The walls themselves sometimes made sounds. As the temperature changed, the soil expanded or contracted slightly. This produced faint cracking or settling noises. Snow accumulating on the roof above added weight, causing the structure to compress minutely. This compression was accompanied by subtle groans, almost below the threshold of hearing. Rain on the roof was more audible. Water striking the sod above created a muffled pattering. It was not the sharp sound of rain on a wooden roof, but a softer, more diffuse noise. Over time, as the roof became saturated and began to drip inside, the sound of water hitting the floor or furniture created a new acoustic element. Families placed containers to catch the drips, and the irregular plinking added to the interior soundscape. Mice and other small animals moving within the walls were sometimes audible. The scrabbling of claws on earth, the faint squeak of a rodent. These sounds reminded the occupants that the structure was permeable to creatures small enough to burrow through. Conversations in the dugout were conducted in normal tones. There was no need to raise voices. The small space and the absence of competing noise meant that whispers carried clearly. This acoustic clarity made privacy difficult. Any conversation could be heard by everyone present. Secrets were nearly impossible to keep within the household. This enforced openness shaped family dynamics. Conflicts had to be managed with the knowledge that every word would be heard. Discussions of sensitive topics were either postponed until privacy could be found outside, or conducted with careful phrasing. The silence also amplified sounds from within one's own body. The beating of the heart, the movement of blood through vessels, the rumble of digestion, all became more noticeable in the quiet. This internal soundscape could be calming or disconcerting depending on one's state of mind. For someone anxious or unwell, the amplification of bodily sounds could heighten discomfort. When sleep came, the silence deepened. The small sounds of waking life ceased. The fire burned lower and quieter. The only remaining sounds were breathing and the occasional shift of a sleeping body. This silence was not empty. It was full of absence. The absence of wind, of external noise, of the vast openness of the plains. It was a silence created by mass, by the weight of earth surrounding the space. It was a silence that spoke of protection, of barriers standing between the vulnerable sleepers and the hostile world outside. And in that silence, the family rested. The olfactory environment of the dugout was intense and complex. It was a layered accumulation of scents, each one contributing to the total atmosphere of the space. The base note was earth itself. Fresh-cut soil has a distinctive smell, organic and mineral at once. In the dugout, this scent was constant, emanating from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. As the structure aged, the earth dried somewhat and the smell changed. The sharp, almost metallic tang of fresh soil gave way to a dustier, more settled odour. But the earthen smell never disappeared. It was the foundation upon which all other scents layered. Smoke was the most prominent addition. Whether from burning wood, buffalo chips or twisted hay, the fire produced smoke that permeated every surface. In structures without proper chimneys, the smoke rose to the ceiling and spread horizontally before finding its way out through gaps in the roof or the doorway. This meant the upper portion of the interior was constantly hazy. The smoke settled into fabric, hair, skin, and the porous surfaces of the walls. Over time, everything in the dugout absorbed the smell. The type of fuel determined the character of the smoke. Wood smoke, when available, had a familiar, almost pleasant quality. Different woods produced different scents. Pine was resinous, oak was sweet, cottonwood was mild. Buffalo chips, when properly dried, burned with surprisingly little odour. The combustion was clean, producing a smoke that was more noticeable for its warmth than its smell. But incompletely dried chips could smoulder rather than burn, producing an acrid smoke that stung the eyes and throat. Families learned to select fuel carefully, choosing only chips that had weathered for a full season. Twisted hay burned too quickly to be a primary fuel, but it was used to start fires or supplement other materials. The smoke from burning grass was light and carried a faint sweetness when the hay was fresh. The smell of cooking added another layer. Foods prepared over the fire absorbed smoke flavour. Stews, bread, roasted meat, all carried the signature of the fire. Rendered fat used for cooking had its own smell, rich and heavy. When meat was fried or grease was used to preserve food, the odour intensified. Some cooking smells were pleasant. Fresh bread baking filled the space with a warm, yeasty aroma. Roasting meat, though it meant the consumption of precious resources, created a smell that signalled abundance and comfort. Other cooking processes were less agreeable. Boiling bones to extract marrow and nutrients produced a smell that was nutritious in result but unpleasant in process. The smell of unwashed bodies was unavoidable. Bathing in winter was rare for practical reasons. Water had to be heated, which consumed fuel. The act of undressing exposed the body to cold air. The wet skin lost heat rapidly. Most people washed only their hands and faces, and even that not daily. Full bathing might occur once a month if resources allowed, or not at all until spring. Sweat, sebum, and the accumulated dirt of daily life created an odour that intensified over the weeks and months. Wool clothing, worn continuously, absorbed this smell and held it. But to the people living in these conditions, the smell was not necessarily offensive. It was familiar. It was the smell of their family, their home. Modern sensibilities might find it intolerable, but those sensibilities are shaped by different standards of cleanliness and different access to washing facilities. When livestock sheltered in or near the dugout, their presence added to the olfactory mix. Cattle, sheep, and pigs all have distinctive smells, particularly in confined spaces. Manure, urine, wet fur, and the warm, musty odour of large animal bodies combined to create an atmosphere that was pungent and organic. This smell was strongest immediately after the animals were brought in from the cold. Their bodies steamed as they warmed, releasing moisture and intensifying the odour. Over time, as the animals settled and the family became accustomed to their presence, the smell became less noticeable. Olfactory adaptation meant that constant exposure diminished perception. But to a visitor entering the dugout from outside, the smell would have been immediately apparent and likely overwhelming. The bedding contributed its own sense. Straw, when fresh, smelled of dried grass and harvest. As it aged and compressed under use, it began to smell of must and decay. Wool blankets, absorbing sweat and body oils, developed a lanolin-rich smell mixed with human scent. Buffalo hides, if not properly cured, could smell of the tanning process or of the animal itself. All of these materials also harboured insects. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs produced no distinctive smell themselves, but their presence contributed to the overall environment. The accumulated effect was a scent profile that was thick, organic, and layered. It was not a single smell, but a composition, changing slightly with the time of day and the activities of the household. After a meal, the smell of food predominated. In the morning, when the fire was rebuilt and fresh fuel added, smoke was most noticeable. At night, the smell of bodies under wool blankets intensified as metabolic heat and respiration concentrated in the sleeping area. This olfactory environment conveyed information. The smell of smoke meant the fire was burning, providing warmth and the ability to cook. The smell of animals meant the livestock had survived another night. The smell of cooking meant there was food. The smell of earth meant the structure was intact, the walls holding. These were not pleasant smells in the aesthetic sense, but they were meaningful smells. They indicated safety, continuity, survival. A change in the normal smell pattern could signal problems. The sharp smell of fresh earth might indicate that part of the wall had collapsed or was eroding. An unusual smoke smell could mean the wrong fuel was burning, or that something in the fire was not meant to be there. The absence of expected smells could also be significant. If the fire went out during the night and the smell of smoke faded, the temperature would begin to drop. Waking to a cold, smoke-free interior meant urgent action was needed to restart the fire. The smell of the dugout was, in a sense, the smell of survival. It was not refined or controlled. It was the product of necessity, of doing what was required to stay alive in a harsh environment. For those who lived in these spaces, the smell became inseparable from the experience of home. Years later, after moving to frame houses with better ventilation and different living conditions, some settlers recalled the smell of the dugout with a kind of nostalgia. Not because it was pleasant, but because it represented a time when survival was uncertain and every day required effort and adaptation. The smell was a reminder of what had been endured and overcome. Blizzards on the Great Plains did not announce themselves with gradual deterioration of weather. They arrived suddenly, driven by cold fronts that moved across the flatland at remarkable speed. The sky might be clear in the morning. By afternoon, a dark line appeared on the northwestern horizon. Within hours, the storm was overhead. The first sign was often a change in the wind. The steady breeze that normally moved across the plains shifted direction. It became erratic, gusting from different angles. Animals sensed the change before humans did. Cattle became restless, horses nickered and paced, birds fell silent and sought shelter. Experienced settlers recognized these signs. When the animals grew agitated and the wind shifted, a storm was coming. Preparations began immediately. Livestock had to be secured. Cattle were brought close to the dugout or into whatever shelter existed for them. Chickens were confined. Horses were hobbled or tied. Fuel was brought inside. Everything that could be gathered in the remaining time was collected and stored within reach of the door. Once the storm began, venturing outside would be dangerous or impossible. Water was hauled. Containers were filled and positioned near the fire where they would not freeze. The door was checked and reinforced. Gaps were stuffed with rags or straw. A heavy blanket or hide was hung on the interior side to provide an additional barrier. Windows, if present, were shuttered. Any opening that could admit wind or drifting snow was sealed. Then the family settled inside and waited. The storm arrived with wind. Not the steady wind of normal weather, but a driving, relentless force that seemed to come from all directions at once. Snow did not fall so much as it was driven horizontally. The flakes were small and hard, more like ice pellets than the large, soft flakes of gentler snowfall. This snow penetrated everywhere. It forced its way through cracks in surface structures. It accumulated against any vertical surface, building drifts that could reach the eaves of buildings within hours. Temperature dropped rapidly. A storm that began when the temperature was 20 degrees above zero could bring air that was 20 or 30 below within the first few hours. Wind speed increased. Sustained winds of 40 to 50 miles per hour were common. Gusts could exceed 60 or 70. At these speeds, the wind carried enough force to knock a person down. Standing upright outside became nearly impossible. Visibility was reduced to nothing. The phenomenon known as a whiteout occurred when blowing snow filled the air so completely that sky and ground became indistinguishable. Direction became impossible to determine. People lost their way between buildings that were only feet apart. For those in frame houses or above-ground sod houses, the storm was terrifying. The wind shook the structure. Snow forced its way inside. The temperature interior dropped rapidly. Fires had to be maintained constantly, but the wind could blow down chimneys, extinguishing flames. Smoke might be pushed back into the room, making the air unbreathable. Families huddled around their stoves, burning fuel as fast as they could feed it, trying to maintain enough warmth to survive. In the dugout, the experience was entirely different. The wind was absent. The thick earth walls absorbed its force completely. The door might rattle slightly if the wind hit it directly, but the interior remained calm. Snow did not penetrate. The solid mass of the walls prevented infiltration. If the door was properly sealed, not a single flake entered. The temperature inside dropped slightly as the exterior temperature fell, but the change was gradual. The thermal mass of the earth delayed the cold's penetration. A small fire was sufficient to maintain comfort. The family did not need to burn fuel frantically. They could conserve their supply, knowing that the walls were doing most of the work of insulation. The silence was profound. Outside, the wind roared. Inside, the family could converse in normal tones. This disconnect between interior calm and exterior chaos created a strange psychological state. Knowing that a deadly storm was happening just beyond the walls, yet experiencing none of its effects, was disorienting. Some families sent someone to crack the door periodically to check on the storm's progress. The rush of wind and snow that entered provided confirmation that the storm was real and ongoing. Then the door closed again, and the calm returned. The storm might last for hours or for days. The blizzard of 1873 that struck in early April continued for 80 hours without significant pause. During such extended storms, life in the dugout contracted to its most basic elements. Eating, sleeping, tending the fire, there was nothing else to do. The darkness of the storm compounded the darkness of the interior. Even during the day, no light penetrated. The family lived by firelight for the duration. Time became difficult to track. Without the sun to mark its passage, hours blended together. Sleep schedules became irregular. People dozed when tired, woke when they had rested. Food was prepared and eaten when hunger dictated rather than at set meal times. Children grew restless. The confinement was difficult for them. Parents tried to keep them occupied with stories, simple games, or tasks that could be performed in the limited space. The air inside became stale. With the door sealed and no ventilation, carbon dioxide from breathing accumulated. The space began to feel close and oppressive. But opening the door to admit fresh air also admitted cold and snow. The balance had to be managed carefully. Brief openings, just long enough to exchange some of the interior air, were timed for moments when the wind seemed to lessen slightly. Outside, the landscape transformed. Snow accumulated in massive drifts. The wind sculpted these drifts into shapes that bore no relation to the terrain beneath. Buildings could be buried completely. Dugouts, being already partially underground, were particularly vulnerable to being covered. If snow drifted over the door, the occupants could find themselves trapped. The weight of the drift made pushing the door open impossible. This happened to families regularly. When the storm finally passed and they tried to exit, the door would not budge. They had to dig from the inside, pushing snow back through the doorway a handful at a time. This was slow, exhausting work in a confined space. In some cases, neighbours had to dig from the outside to free those trapped within. But even when buried, the family inside remained safe. The snow actually added insulation. The temperature inside might even rise slightly as the snow blocked drafts and created an additional barrier. As long as they had fuel and food, they could wait out the burial until rescue came, or they could dig themselves free. When the storm finally ended, the silence outside matched the silence inside. The wind stopped. The snow ceased falling. The first person to venture out found a transformed world. Familiar landmarks were gone, buried under drifts. The horizon was an unbroken expanse of white. The work of digging out began. Paths had to be cleared, Livestock had to be checked. Some animals would have survived, others would be found frozen, buried in drifts. But the family had survived. The dugout had protected them. The earth had stood between them and the storm, and it had not failed. The dugout was not without risks. The same properties that made it effective for thermal protection also created vulnerabilities. The structure was made of organic materials, sod, grass roots, wooden supports. All of these were subject to decay. Moisture was the primary agent of degradation. Rain, snow, and the condensation from human respiration all introduced water into the structure. The sod roof was particularly vulnerable. When dry, it was relatively stable. When wet, it became heavy and prone to failure. A heavy rain could add thousands of pounds to the roof's weight. If the wooden supports were already weakened by rot, this additional load could exceed their capacity. Collapse could happen without warning. The ridgepole might crack, the rafters give way. The entire mass of sod would come down in an instant. If the family was inside, the consequences could be severe. The falling earth could trap people, causing injury or death. Even if no one was hurt, the collapse destroyed the shelter. Everything inside was buried. Food stores, possessions, bedding, all were mixed with wet sod and debris. Recovery required excavating the interior, salvaging what could be saved, and rebuilding. Some families kept tools inside specifically for this purpose. Shovels were stored where they could be reached quickly in the event of a collapse. The walls, though more stable than the roof, also deteriorated over time. Erosion was constant. Wind and rain wore away the exposed surfaces. Burrowing animals created weaknesses. Prairie dogs, ground squirrels, and larger mammals like badgers dug into the earthen walls, creating tunnels and voids. These voids compromised structural integrity. A wall riddled with animal burrows could not support the roof properly. Settlers attempted to discourage burrowing by reinforcing the exterior walls with stone or additional sod. But the animals were persistent. Snakes presented a unique danger. Rattlesnakes, common on the plains, sought shelter in the thick walls of the dugout. The walls provided protection from temperature extremes and predators. Snakes would enter through small openings or dig their own passages. In winter, they hibernated within the walls. The warmth from the interior of the dugout could wake them prematurely. Families occasionally encountered snakes that had emerged from the walls into the living space. A rattlesnake coiled near the sleeping area or basking near the fire was a deadly threat. Killing the snake was necessary but difficult in the confined space. A cornered rattlesnake would strike. The close quarters made avoiding a bite challenging. Snake bites in winter were particularly dangerous. Medical help was often far away. The cold weather made travel difficult. Treatment options were limited. Some families learned to identify the entry points snakes used and sealed them. But new openings appeared as the structure aged. Smaller pests were constant. Mice and rats entered through any gap they could find. They nested in the walls and the bedding. These rodents consumed stored food. They gnawed on fabric, leather, and even wood. Their droppings contaminated surfaces. Worse, they carried fleas and diseases. The close living conditions meant that any illness the rodents brought could spread quickly to humans. Cats were sometimes kept to control rodent populations. A good mouser could make the difference between tolerable pest levels and infestation. But cats also required food and care. In times of scarcity, keeping a cat meant sharing already limited resources. Insects were equally problematic. Fleas infested the bedding and bit the occupants constantly. The itching was maddening, and scratching could lead to infected sores. Bedbugs hid in crevices during the day and emerged at night to feed. Their bites caused welts and disrupted sleep. No effective treatment existed. The bedding could not be washed or exposed to extreme heat to kill the insects. Families endured the bites as an unavoidable aspect of dugout life. The fine hail of dirt was another persistent annoyance. As the sod ceiling dried, small particles of soil became dislodged and fell. This happened continuously. Dust settled on surfaces, food and bedding. It was impossible to keep anything clean. Meals required covering dishes immediately after serving. Bedding had to be shaken out regularly, though this merely redistributed the dust rather than eliminating it. Breathing the dust caused respiratory irritation. People developed chronic coughs. Children seemed particularly affected. The dugout's darkness contributed to accidents. In the dim interior, people tripped over objects, struck their heads on low beams, or stumbled into the fire. Burns from the hearth or stove were common. In close quarters, brushing against hot metal was nearly unavoidable. Children were especially at risk. They moved quickly and without the caution of adults. A child could fall into the fire or grab a hot pot before anyone could intervene. The lack of windows also meant that smoke accumulation could reach dangerous levels. Carbon monoxide from incomplete combustion was odourless and could cause unconsciousness or death. Families relied on physical sensation to gauge air quality. If dizziness, headache or nausea occurred, the door was open to ventilate the space. But in severe cold or during storms, opening the door was itself dangerous. The family had to balance the risk of smoke against the risk of freezing. Structural settling created hazards. As the sod compressed and the wooden supports adjusted to their load, gaps could open in floors or walls. A person could catch their foot in such a gap and fall. Ankles and legs were twisted or broken. With no medical care readily available, such injuries healed slowly or not at all. A broken bone could leave someone permanently impaired. Fire was perhaps the greatest danger. The combination of opened flames, dry straw, and wooden supports created constant risk. A spark escaping the hearth could ignite the bedding. Straw, once lit, burned quickly. The flames could spread to the wooden roof supports before anyone could react. In the confined space, escape was difficult. The single door might be blocked by flames. Windows, if they existed, were too small to climb through. Families practiced fire awareness constantly. The fire was never left unattended. Sparks were monitored. Water was kept nearby for emergencies. But despite precautions, fires happened. Entire dugouts were destroyed. Families lost everything. Those who survived a fire often had to rebuild completely or abandon the site. The dugout was a living structure in the sense that it was made of organic materials that continued to change over time. But it was also a dying structure, constantly degrading and requiring maintenance. The balance between its protective properties and its inherent risks defined the experience of living within it. Families accepted these dangers because the alternative, exposure to the winter without shelter, was worse. The dugout was imperfect. It was vulnerable, but it was what they had. Rain and snowmelt introduced a particular misery to dugout life. The sod roof, designed to insulate and protect, became a reservoir that slowly released water into the interior. The process began when precipitation saturated the upper layers of sod. The grass and roots absorbed water like a sponge. The soil between them became waterlogged. Gravity pulled this water downward. It percolated through the layers of sod, through the brush and hay beneath, until it reached the interior ceiling. Then it dripped. The dripping did not start immediately. It might be hours after a rain began before the first drops appeared inside, but once it started, it continued long after the rain stopped. The thick sod held enormous amounts of water. This water released slowly over days or even weeks. The drips were unpredictable. They did not fall from consistent locations. One day, water might drip near the door. The next day, a new leak appeared over the sleeping area. This unpredictability made managing the problem difficult. Containers had to be positioned to catch the drips, but they needed constant repositioning as new leaks developed. The sound of water hitting tin or wooden buckets was constant. During heavy drips, the irregular rhythm, plop, 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 created an acoustic backdrop that made concentration difficult and sleep elusive. The drips were muddy. The water carried soil particles from the sod. Each drop that fell deposited a tiny amount of sediment. Over time, this sediment accumulated. Surfaces became coated with a fine layer of mud. Food had to be covered constantly to prevent contamination. Bedding was particularly vulnerable. A drip falling on blankets or hides soaked them quickly. Wet wool lost its insulating properties. Wet buffalo hide became heavy and cold. Families tried to protect the bedding by covering it with waterproof materials during the day. Oilcloth, if available, was spread over the sleeping area when it was not in use. But at night, when the family was actually sleeping, such protection was impractical. They simply endured the occasional drip landing on them during the night. Being struck by a cold, muddy drop while trying to sleep was unpleasant. It woke the sleeper, necessitating a shift in position to avoid the new leak. The floor became the ultimate destination for all the water. The earth floor absorbed some of it, but when the dripping was heavy, the floor became saturated. Mud formed. The packed earth that had been hard and stable turned into a slick, sticky surface. Walking across the floor tracked mud everywhere. It clung to shoes, to clothing, to anything that touched the ground. Furniture, if it had legs, sank into the softened floor. Chairs and tables tilted as the ground beneath them gave way unevenly. Items stored on the floor had to be elevated. Boxes and bags were placed on planks or stones to keep them out of the mud. The humidity inside the dugout increased dramatically during wet periods. The combination of dripping water and reduced ventilation, the door had to stay closed to keep out the rain, created a damp, close atmosphere. This humidity prevented clothing from drying. Wet garments hung near the fire remained damp for days. The smell of wet wool and mildew permeated the space. Mould began to grow. It appeared on leather, on stored food, on the walls themselves. The organic materials of the structure provided ample substrate for fungal growth. This mould was not just unsightly, it caused respiratory problems. People developed coughs and congestion that persisted for weeks. The wait for the dripping to stop was a test of patience. There was nothing that could be done to speed the process. The roof would release its water at its own pace. All the family could do was manage the symptoms, move containers, wipe surfaces, shift positions to avoid the worst leaks, and wait. The psychological weight of this waiting was significant. The dripping was a constant reminder that the structure was failing in some way. It eroded confidence in the shelter. Children found the dripping distressing. They didn't understand why it continued long after the rain stopped. They asked repeatedly when it would end. Parents had no good answer. They could only reassure the children that it would eventually stop, even though they themselves did not know when that would be. Spring thaw was the worst time for dripping. The accumulated snow on the roof melted as temperatures rose. This released enormous volumes of water all at once. The dripping became a steady flow. Multiple leaks opened simultaneously. The interior of the dugout transformed into a muddy swamp. Families sometimes describe this period as worse than the depths of winter. At least in winter, everything was frozen. The cold was harsh, but at least it was dry. Spring brought warmth, but it also brought mud. The transition from frozen to thawed meant everything inside the dugout became damp and dirty. The only solution was to wait for the roof to dry completely. This required sustained warm weather and wind to evaporate the moisture. As the sod dried, it contracted. This sometimes opened new cracks, which would leak during the next rain. The cycle repeated. Maintenance could help. After the roof dried, additional sod could be added to low spots where water pooled. Cracks could be filled with clay or fresh sod. But this maintenance required labour and materials. It had to be timed for periods when the weather was favourable and the roof was dry enough to work on. Many families simply endured the dripping as an inevitable aspect of dugout life. They accepted that the interior would be damp for weeks each spring. They knew that despite the discomfort, the structure was still functioning. The drips were annoying, but the roof was not collapsing. The walls were still standing. The family was still protected from the wind and the more severe elements. The drip was a price paid for that protection. It was manageable, if unpleasant. And eventually, it always stopped. The roof dried, the floor hardened, the interior returned to its normal state of relative dryness, until the next rain. The dugout was never intended to be permanent. It was a solution to an immediate problem. The need for shelter in an environment that provided few building materials. As circumstances improved, as families accumulated resources and access to timber, many chose to build frame houses above ground. These new houses had windows that admitted light. They had wooden floors that did not turn to mud. They stood tall enough to allow a person to stand upright anywhere in the room. They represented progress, a move away from the primitive conditions of the early settlement years. But these frame houses were colder. The thin wooden walls provided minimal insulation. The wind penetrated through gaps in the construction. Fuel consumption increased dramatically. Some families, after spending a winter in their new frame house, returned to the dugout. The comfort of a light and headroom could not compensate for the lack of warmth. Others kept the dugout as a secondary shelter, using it during the worst weather while living in the frame house when conditions were milder. But eventually, as better construction techniques developed and materials became more available, the dugouts were abandoned. Without maintenance, they degraded quickly. The roof was the first element to fail. The wooden supports rotted through. The weight of the sod became too great. The roof sagged, then collapsed inward. The sod that had formed the ceiling fell into the interior, filling the space. The walls, no longer supported by the roof structure, began to erode. Rain washed away the exposed surfaces, wind carried off the loosened soil. Within a few years, the walls slumped. The rectangular pit that had been carefully carved began to soften. Its edges became rounded. Grass grew over the disturbed earth. The prairie reclaimed the site. After a decade, little remained to indicate that a dwelling had ever existed. A slight depression in the ground, perhaps. A scatter of broken pottery or rusted metal if someone searched carefully. But the structure itself had returned to the earth from which it had been made. This dissolution was not tragic. It was appropriate. The dugout had never resisted the landscape. It had been carved from it, built of its materials, and it returned to it when no longer needed. The grass that formed the walls simply rejoined the prairie. The soil that had sheltered the family settled back into the contours of the land. In medieval Europe, the same process occurred with abandoned Grubenhäuser. The pits filled with debris and sediment. The wooden posts rotted away. Grass and weeds grew over the sites. Within a generation, the location of a Grubenhaus might be forgotten entirely. Archaeologists now excavate these sites, carefully removing the fill from the pits to understand how the structures were built and used. They find post holes where the roof supports once stood. They find hearths where fires burned. They find loom weights, pottery shards, animal bones, the remnants of daily life. But they do not find the structures intact. Those returned to the earth centuries ago. The impermanence of these dwellings stands in contrast to stone or brick architecture. A castle or cathedral can endure for centuries, even millennia, as a monument to the people who built it. The dugout leaves almost no trace. Its monument is not in what remains, but in the survival of the families who lived within it. They endured winters that could have killed them. They adapted to conditions that seem unimaginable to modern sensibilities. They did this not through technological innovation or imported materials, but through understanding the properties of the earth itself. They recognized that the soil beneath their feet held a stable temperature. They understood that mass could block wind and that thickness could insulate. They knew that bodies generate heat, that proximity amplifies that heat, and that proper materials can trap it. This knowledge was not written down. It was not formalized into engineering principles. It was simply practiced, passed from one family to another through demonstration and experience. When the era of the dugout passed, much of this knowledge faded. Later generations, living in heated homes with insulated walls, did not need to understand thermal mass or the properties of sod. But the dugout remains as a historical fact. It happened. People lived this way, and they survived. The earth that sheltered them continues its cycles. The grass grows, dies, and grows again. The soil freezes and thaws with the seasons. The planet's thermal stability, which made the dugout possible, continues unchanged. The same physics that kept a family warm in 1875 would work today. The dugout was not beautiful. It was not comfortable by modern standards. It was dark, often damp, and shared with pests. But it was warm. It was quiet. It was a refuge from wind that could kill. And when the family emerged each spring, when the door opened and light flooded in, they had survived another winter. The earth had held them. It had protected them. And when they no longer needed that protection, it took back what had always been its own. The cycle completed. The shelter dissolved. The land remained. And somewhere beneath the prairie grass, in the slight depression that marks where a dugout once stood, the soil still holds its constant temperature. 50 degrees, steady, unchanging, waiting, as it has always waited, to shelter those who understand its properties. The history of the dugout is written not in monuments but in survival, in the knowledge that when shelter is needed, the earth provides, and that knowledge, though the structures have vanished, remains.